Okay. So I'd introduced myself this morning, but I'll do it again. So my background is from a neutron facility, typically covering many thousands of users, covering a very broad range of science, from physical sciences to life sciences, and most of the access would be direct, not remote, except during the pandemic. But as it's a different topic, I was going to make a few different points this afternoon than I made this morning. And so the first bit is about widening the user base. So I would point out that most research infrastructures we're talking about are nationally funded, mainly nationally funded. And many national research infrastructures, actually in the area I work in, most of them have an open access policy. So the funding is not related to the access. However, most international research infrastructures relate access to funding, because typically they have very particular rules on how you fund them, and therefore how much people get access, because they want to get access to what they paid for. So first of all, there's already a difference between national and international in terms of opportunities for widening the user base. But also it's very important to point out that many facilities already operate at capacity. We always talk about widening, but actually widening is either going to require additional investment, because you can increase your capacity through investment either in infrastructure or in people, or it's going to be at the expense of existing users. The alternative, which is potentially the positive bit about remote access, is increasing collaboration. So you might have existing users, but they can broaden their range of collaborations and opportunities. But I think I struggle quite often with people having the expectation that research infrastructures can just widen their user bases indefinitely, and somehow there's no cost and there's no problem involved with that. So the capacity point is very important. In terms of access to experimental capabilities, so then if access is remote, the distance is actually irrelevant. So the opportunities are the same whether they're local or global. We actually had a very good experience during the pandemic of a group from Toronto in Canada working with a group from Oxford in the UK doing an experiment where actually they could divide it up and do what they could do shifts in different time zones, and it was extremely effective in doing that experiment. So there's some slightly odd things you can do. But certainly the point I made this morning is that highly automated short experiments are very much more efficient if they're remote. And that enables the user community to increase enormously, not only just because they're short, but also because you don't have the overhead time of different people coming in, different people losing, etc. Access to digital capabilities, and we've mostly been talking about physical infrastructures rather than digital infrastructures. Certainly for large data sets, remote access can be network limited. And so that's a particularly important thing, because remote access is maybe in principle possible, but in practice it's really, really difficult. So it depends on your computer networks. And some users still physically take data away on disk. Actually, sometimes it's the quickest way to do it for very large data sets, even nowadays. Not all users have the capacity locally to store and analyze large data volumes. So again, facilities tend to need to provide increasing amounts of data surfaces as data volumes increase, and that then needs to be remotely accessible, because the users are having to analyze and store their data at the facility rather than taking it home. And that's been the trend over the last 10 or 20 years. That, of course, means improved digital tools, so that benefits both on-site and remote users, so there's no downside to that. And clearly, if you're going to do a hybrid experiment with real participation from distance and locally, you absolutely have to have the remote users being able to fully participate in the data analysis, possibly not the control, but certainly in anything to do with the data. So my summary of the sort of opportunities and risks in this is, I think hybrid access, that means a mixed group of people, some remotely, some locally, is very likely to increase for all types of research infrastructures. I think that's a definite trend. And more geographically dispersed collaborations are therefore enabled, including, as I mentioned, working across time zones, which is important for 24/7 facilities. Open access facilities can therefore attract global users. And it was mentioned just previously, for example, something about visa restrictions, etc. So that actually enables things that otherwise can be quite difficult and expensive. and enable access for developing countries. I remember quite distinctly being at a meeting maybe 10 years ago organized by IAEA, which was for scientists from developing countries to learn about some of the large research infrastructures. And I was very specifically asked in a discussion session, what is the point in showing us about these wonderful research infrastructures if we are never going to have the chance to use them? And that was a very good point. And this new remote access does give you the opportunity to involve developing countries. And I think the example of the Sesame synchrotron that's now being built in Africa, and also on the African synchrotron as well, are research infrastructures which have justified themselves on the basis of having some sort of access previously. So this is very good for helping developing countries. Downside is that research infrastructures become more service providers than research collaborators, which was mentioned before this morning. The training need, obviously that's already just been mentioned, and said not necessarily reducing the net carbon footprint. But also, as we increase open access, we allow more and more people to use facilities, the funding agencies, whoever they are, national or not, will ask the question, who is paying for what and why are they paying for it? And we have to address that question, because otherwise we'll be asked to decrease our access rather than